Imagine this. Not just a simple deception, not a minor court intrigue, but something far more monumental. Something that makes you doubt the very fabric of historical truth. Picture a man who, without a drop of royal blood, without titles, without a real past, managed to convince Europe's most powerful monarchs of his absolute legitimacy. A man who made them believe he was a ghost from the past, a resurrected heir long buried in the annals of palace secrets. A man who challenged not just a king, but an entire dynasty, and almost turned England upside down. This isn't a Hollywood blockbuster plot. It's the stark reality of the 15th century, and the name of this virtuoso of deception is Perkin Warbeck. Let's be frank. History isn't just about grand portraits and heroic sagas. It also has a dirty underbelly, woven from ambition, lies, and unscrupulous manipulation. And among all these intricate schemes, Perkin Warbeck shines like a first-magnitude star, an absolute champion of historical fraud. This young man, whose true origins were as murky as a London fog, dared to declare himself Richard, Duke of York, one of the two princes in the Tower, sons of King Edward IV, who were believed to have vanished without a trace, murdered on the orders of their uncle, Richard III. Think about it. One of the most mysterious and tragic episodes in English history, the disappearance of the young princes, suddenly gets a live continuation, embodied in the figure of this impostor. This wasn't just audacity. It was impudence elevated to an art form, and what's most absurd, yet at the same time ingenious. They believed him. Margaret of Burgundy, sister of two kings and aunt to the vanished princes, became his chief patron and mentor. The kings of France and Scotland, the Holy Roman Emperor, they all believed him. They didn't just believe. They accepted him as a legitimate heir, paid him homage, and provided him with troops and resources. This wasn't merely a mistake or naivete. It was a calculated, cynical blow against the shaky throne of Henry VII, the founder of the new Tudor dynasty, whose legitimacy hung by a thread after the Wars of the Roses. Anyone who held a grudge against Henry, anyone who wanted to destabilize England, saw Perkin Warbeck as the ideal battering ram. He became the living embodiment of a counter-argument, a walking doubt in Henry's right to the crown. And this was not just a challenge. It was a ticking time bomb planted right under Westminster Abbey. How was such a thing possible? How could a man without lineage or tribe, without any real support beyond an artificially created legend, so masterfully manipulate the minds of entire states? The answer lies not only in his personal talent for impersonation, but also in the dark, sometimes repulsive, mechanisms of power. In a world where the right to the throne was determined not only by blood, but by the ability to persuade, to create myths, Perkin Warbeck became living proof that reality is merely a matter of conviction. That truth is what sufficiently influential people believe. And this scam, one of the most audacious and large-scale in history, exposes the cynicism of the political game, where human lives and the fates of entire kingdoms are mere pawns in the struggle for power. This is a story not only about an impostor, but also about those who created him, who used him, and how easily truth can be substituted to serve political ambitions. But who was this man, capable of such a grand mystification? Where did this prince come from, whose appearance was a bolt from the blue for all of Europe? What was his true story before he donned the mask of a long-dead heir? And what forces stood behind the scenes of this incredible production, turning a simple young man into a puppet on the chessboard of great powers? We've already discussed the scale of this grand deception, how Perkin Warbeck, like a phantom, roamed European courts, convincing kings and emperors of his royal blood. But who was this man really? Where did this phenomenon, this living prop in a great political play, come from? Forget about blue blood and ancient lineages. Our hero, Perkin Warbeck, was a product of a far more mundane, yet no less intriguing, reality. The son of a Flemish customs official, or, according to other accounts, a humble merchant from Tournai, he had nothing but the ordinary life of medieval existence. No coats of arms, no hint of aristocratic origin. Just an ordinary life, at times even unglamorous, but paradoxically, it became his invisible school. His early travels along Europe's trade routes, life among merchants and sailors, constant changes of faces and languages, all this honed in him an incredible adaptability, a talent for mimicry, for instantaneous transformation. He absorbed foreign manners, accents, and customs like a sponge soaked in others' stories, and crucially, he mastered several languages: French, Dutch, English, and possibly Latin. He was not just a young man, he was a blank slate, perfectly prepared for someone else's inscription. Imagine, a young man with refined manners, noble features, innate charm, but without any compromising past. He was like a sculpture waiting to be molded into any form. And so, one day, somewhere in the back alleys of European ports, or in the shadows of merchant stalls, this natural talent was noticed. Not just noticed, but chosen. Chosen by agents of Margaret of Burgundy, the very woman who burned with a desire for revenge against Henry VII and desperately needed a living symbol of the Yorkist dynasty. This wasn't a casting call. It was a recruitment point, a point of no return, after which Perkin Warbeck's life ceased to be his own. He became a project. And this project demanded total immersion. Months, even years of intensive, grueling preparation began. He wasn't just going to play a role. He was going to become it. To forget his name, his past, his real family. Imagine those lessons. Hours spent studying court etiquette, how to hold oneself at the table, how to bow to kings, how to behave during a hunt, how to speak with noblemen, manners, gestures, gait. Everything had to scream of his noble birth, of his being born for the throne. He was taught not just to speak, but to sound like a prince. Inflections, pauses, even specific dialectal peculiarities, characteristic of the royal court. His body was taught to move with the dignity accustomed to those who had never known want or limitations. Every gesture, every glance, every smile had to be precise and flawless. It was truly a royal school, but with one difference. Its graduate was a counterfeit, a diamond created in the laboratory of intrigue. But the most chilling and perhaps ingenious part of this preparation was the creation of his own childhood. Memories he never had were implanted into his mind, of life at Edward IV's court, of his elder brother Edward V, of playing with the royal sisters, of details of life in the Tower, of conversations with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville. He needed to know every trivial detail of Prince Richard's biography, every detail of his lineage, all the intricacies of English politics. He was taught the history of the Yorkist dynasty, as if he himself were its living embodiment. Names and faces of courtiers he had never seen were drilled into him. Stories were told of events he had never witnessed. He had to know what royal chambers smelled like, what the wine served at banquets tasted like, what King Edward's laughter sounded like. Each of these memories was meticulously constructed to give his lie conviction, to make it not just plausible but tangible. This wasn't just rote learning, it was the psychological implantation of a personality. He had to not only speak like a prince but also feel like a prince. Perhaps at some point he himself began to believe what was instilled in him, dissolving into this fantasy, becoming an integral part of it. After all, there is no better actor than one who believes in his role. And here we come to the most interesting part, the psychology of this transformation. What happens to a person when their own identity is erased, and a foreign one is implanted in its place, like an artificial limb? Did Perkin lose himself in this role? Or was he such a brilliant manipulator that he perceived it all as a grand game, with himself as the main player? Perhaps he felt chosen, for he, a simple young man, was given the chance to try on a crown. Or, conversely, was he a prisoner of this golden cage, aware that every mistake could cost him his life? Such immersion in another's fate is not just acting. It is a painful process that changes a person forever. He ceased to be Perkin Warbeck and became a living phantom, the shadow of a long-dead prince. Warbeck, this young chameleon, was not created by God, but by the cynical calculation of European monarchs and one very intelligent, very vengeful woman. He was a perfect, refined instrument. A phantom given flesh and blood so he could roam the earth and sow chaos. And when this phantom, honed to perfection, was ready, when every thread was adjusted and his voice trained, the time came for his triumphant debut on the grand stage. The time to reveal the white rose of England to the world and challenge the legitimate king, using only illusion and the mastery of transformation. This puppet was ready to dance. The curtain rose. The stage was set, the scenery arranged, and the main actor, Perkin Warbeck, polished to a gleam by others' will and his own incredible talent for mimicry, prepared for his entrance. He was no longer the son of a Flemish customs official. He was a ghost returned from oblivion, a king awaited. And this game, ladies and gentlemen, was grand. The first scene. His Irish debut in Cork. An unexpected and strangely spontaneous triumph. Warbeck arrived there not as a prince asserting his rights, but as an ordinary merchant accompanying a trader. But no sooner had he appeared than locals, intoxicated by rumors and a desire for change, latched onto him. Ireland, always simmering with discontent towards the English crown, was fertile ground for anyone who could challenge Henry VII. And there they were, these uneducated but passionate people, who themselves saw in him Richard, Duke of York. He didn't present himself. They recognized him. It was the purest theater of the absurd. Imagine, a crowd, gripped by collective hysteria, gazing at the young man's face, and each seeing what they wanted to see. Hope, salvation, a legitimate heir, not a Tudor upstart. Perkin, trained to the smallest detail, with adopted manners and the language of a true prince, did not disabuse them. He simply allowed this wave to engulf him, elegantly accepting the role so obligingly offered. He was impeccable. His bearing, his speech, his ability to listen and respond with royal dignity. All of it stunned the Irish. They proclaimed him their king, and this moment became the starting point for the most audacious political spectacle of the Middle Ages. It was less his plan than a masterful exploitation of others' plans, others' faith, others' naivety. The consequences? Rumors of the ghost prince spread across Europe, reaching the ears of monarchs eager to destabilize England. The second scene. A daring appearance at the court of King Charles VIII of France. If in Ireland he was self-proclaimed, here at the center of the European political game, Warbeck had to endure a much stricter examination, and he passed. Charles VIII, young, ambitious, but not without pragmatism, received the Duke of York with truly royal honors. Not because he believed in his lineage, but because he saw in him an ideal pawn. A pawn capable of casting a shadow on Henry VII's legitimacy, distracting him from French ambitions in Italy, making him nervous, and forcing him to spend resources on internal strife. Charles VIII's court became the next stage in Perkin's training. Here he honed his courtly manners, participated in royal hunts, banquets, and councils. He was not just an actor. He became part of this dangerous game. The French crown provided him with lodging, a retinue, even a guard, all the attributes of a true prince. This was his shining moment, a time when he, in essence, challenged one of Europe's most powerful kings while sitting in his own palace. However, as is often the case in high politics, a card played today might be discarded tomorrow. Suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, expulsion followed. Henry VII, no fool, acted swiftly and decisively. He concluded a peace treaty with Charles VIII at Naples, and one of the conditions was the cessation of support for any English rebels, including, of course, our prince. Warbeck was politely but firmly escorted out of France. This was the first warning sign, the first failure, but it only hardened him, forcing him to seek new patrons. And now, the third most spectacular scene. Recognition by Margaret of Burgundy. This was the apotheosis, the culmination of the entire affair, its theatrical peak. Margaret, aunt of the real princes in the Tower, sister of Edward IV and Richard III, was not just a patron. She was the architect, director, and chief financier of this grand production. She was driven not only by hatred for Henry Tudor, but also by a deep, almost pathological desire for revenge for the demise of the Yorkist dynasty. She received Warbeck at her residence in Mechlin, and there this very recognition took place. It was a pure staging, meticulously rehearsed down to the smallest detail. Margaret, a woman of iron will and considerable acting talent, publicly embraced him, weeping with joy and relief. She announced to the world that this young man was her nephew, Richard, Duke of York, miraculously saved from the clutches of the usurper Richard III, and then from the grasp of Henry VII. She bestowed upon him the grand title, White Rose of England, a symbol of the Yorkist dynasty, challenging the Red Rose of the Tudors. This was not just recognition. It was a public proclamation, legitimization, consecration. Margaret not only provided him with asylum and funds, she opened the doors of European courts for him. Her authority, her connections, her influence were colossal. Thanks to this recognition, Warbeck became not just an impostor, but an international figure. He received ambassadors, conducted negotiations, and was recognized by kings and emperors, from Archduke Philip the Handsome to Emperor Maximilian I. He was at the peak of his power, reveling in the authority, attention, and illusion of his own royal destiny. His charisma, his training, his incredible audacity allowed him to masterfully exploit the vanity, ambition, and political calculations of European monarchs to conquer Europe and cast a shadow on Henry VII's legitimacy. But even in this brilliant spectacle, where Perkin Warbeck seemed invincible, other intrigues were already brewing behind the scenes, and not all threads were in his hands. In the shadows behind the screens of European politics, other players were at work, whose motives were far deeper and more dangerous. If up until now we have observed the masterful spectacle performed by Perkin Warbeck on the European stage, now it's time to look behind the curtain, where the true puppeteers pulled the strings. And believe me, those hands were far dirtier, and the motives deeper, than a simple desire to reclaim the throne. At the center of this web of intrigue sat a figure whose hatred for Henry VII was as all-consuming as her political weight, the powerful Margaret of Burgundy, sister of two kings, Edward IV and Richard III. For her, Perkin Warbeck was not merely an impostor. He was a living, breathing weapon of revenge, a sharp needle designed to pierce the heart of Tudor usurpation. Her motives? Not just grief for the vanished nephews, the princes in the Tower, whose fate still stirs minds, but cold, calculated political revenge. She saw Henry not as a king, but as an upstart whose blood had no right to stain the English throne. Therefore, she invested not only her immense wealth, but also all her authority and diplomatic network into this project, transforming the young Fleming into a royal phantom, capable of frightening any monarch. Margaret was not just a patron. She was the architect of this entire grand deception, the conductor of the orchestra of lies. But Margaret did not act alone. Behind Perkin stood an entire army of shadows. Among them was the elusive Stephen Freon, one of her trusted agents, who likely handled the initial casting and training of our prince. He was the gray eminence who refined Warbeck's manners, drilled memories of a royal childhood into his mind, creating the illusion of reality. And then came Sir Robert Clifford, an English nobleman whose name alone was a guarantee of truth for many naive Yorkist supporters. His defection to Warbeck's side was not just a betrayal of his own crown, but a powerful propaganda move. Clifford not only brought invaluable information from English circles, but also became a key link in the spy network aimed at destabilizing Henry's throne. What drove them? For Freon, loyalty to his mistress, and probably a substantial reward. For Clifford, ambition, a thirst for power, and perhaps a genuine belief in the righteous cause of the Yorks, mixed with a desire to be on the right side of history if the prince prevailed. The risks? Death, dishonor, losing everything. But when a crown is at stake, the stakes are always astronomical. And here, at the other end of this deadly chessboard, sat the main antagonist, Henry VII. A man whose crown was won not by birthright but on the battlefield, he was consumed by paranoia. Every whisper, every shadow seemed like a conspiracy. He was a genius of survival, a master of intrigue, surpassing even his enemies. While Margaret created her ghost king, Henry built his own empire, an empire of espionage. His agents, his eyes and ears, penetrated every corner of Europe, intercepting letters, bribing servants, seeking out the slightest clues. He didn't just react to Warbeck's threat. He anticipated it, analyzed it, and methodically destroyed it. His countermeasures were ruthless, diplomatic pressure on European monarchs, who, although they received Warbeck, dared not openly oppose mighty England. Massive propaganda portraying Perkin not just as an impostor, but as a Flemish bastard, a tool of enemies. He used his connections, his treasury, to sow discord among Warbeck's supporters, bribe them, and turn them into double agents. Henry VII was no knight in shining armor. He was a pragmatic, cynical politician, ready for any dirty game to preserve his power. He understood that war is not always won on the battlefield, but often in the dark alleys of diplomacy and the chambers of intrigue. And while Perkin played his role before the public, Henry waged a far more dangerous game behind the scenes, where every step could be his last. This epic was not the story of a single impostor, but a grand clash between two titans, the old aristocracy clinging to its rights, and the new dynasty holding power with an iron grip. Behind every welcome, every royal reception given to Warbeck, lay Margaret's meticulously crafted plan. Behind every failure, every exposure, lay Henry's cold calculation. It was a war of nerves, information, and betrayals, where every piece on the board, from a powerful duchess to a humble agent, played its part in this bloody game. And although it seems Warbeck was merely a puppet, his appearance made the foundations of an entire kingdom tremble, exposing all the cracks and rot within the walls of power. But even the most elaborate spectacles eventually come to an end. And when the masks begin to fall and the stage lights become too bright, it's time for reckoning. A time when the threads that seem so strong begin to fray, and even the Ghost King realizes that his throne is merely a mirage. So what can this medieval farcical tragedy, this charade with a crowned phantom, tell us? The primary, most sobering lesson from Perkin Warbeck's story isn't just a file on a clever impostor. It's an anatomy of human susceptibility, an ode to the ability to believe what one desperately wants to believe, even if it contradicts common sense and facts. The illusion created by Margaret of Burgundy and her cynical puppeteers proved more powerful than any reality, any official chronicle. Why? Because it offered hope for revanche, fueled hatred for the new regime, and served as a convenient flag for those who crave change or simply power. Do you think these are matters of a bygone era? You're mistaken. Look around. The modern world is a theater of the absurd, where the scenery changes faster than you can blink, but the play remains the same. The phenomenon of imposture, political manipulation, fake news, myth-making, and personality cults, these are not inventions of the 21st century. They are merely modernized, technologically enhanced versions of ancient, world-old technologies for controlling mass consciousness. Recall how many times we've seen a new messiah, a hero unexpectedly resurrected, or a forgotten heir appearing out of nowhere to solve all problems? Or conversely, how many times have we been fed a public enemy whose existence was merely a convenient fiction? What methods used by Warbeck and his puppeteers, these medieval PR specialists and political strategists, are employed today in politics, media, and the internet? First, meticulous product preparation. It's not enough to simply declare yourself someone. You need to create a legend, refine manners, implant the right memories. Today, this is done through carefully planned media campaigns, information leaks, crafting a desired image on social networks, and the absurdly advanced technology of deep fakes. Second, seeking authoritative confirmation. Margaret of Burgundy was the ideal influencer of her time. Her word carried weight with monarchs. Today, these are opinion leaders, experts with dubious reputations, or even entire media holdings willing to confirm any nonsense for an appropriate fee, creating the illusion of consensus. Third, playing on emotions. The hope for the return of a just king, the hatred for the usurper. All this was masterfully used to mobilize supporters. Today, it's fear of the other, anger at elites, nostalgia for a golden age, resentment over lost greatness. Emotions are the shortest path to irrational decisions, to abandoning critical thinking. Fourth, creating echo and resonance. Warbeck traveled through European courts, each time gathering a new audience and amplifying his legend. Modern politics and media involve the endless replication of the same narratives until they become truth, simply by frequency of repetition. These are news hooks that are picked up and inflated, shaping the collective unconscious, and sometimes even mass psychosis. And of course, the use of useful idiots and double agents. Henry VII's system for combating fakes was ingenious in its cynicism. Today, these are armies of bots, trolls, paid commentators, and independent bloggers who create the illusion of public opinion and sometimes genuinely change it. The story of Perkin Warbeck is not just an anecdote from the past. It is a mirror reflecting our own, painfully human need for myths. Our readiness to believe a beautiful lie if it promises us something, salvation, justice, or simply a captivating spectacle that distracts from dull reality. Why does human nature so readily latch onto heroes, even if they are false? Or onto victims to mourn and avenge? How deeply ingrained in us is the inclination towards deception and, more frighteningly, self-deception. In a world where information is the new power, and disinformation its main tool, the line between truth and fiction remains alarmingly thin. And sometimes, to know who you really are, a king or an imposter, you just need to look more closely at those who are willing to believe in you. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the abyss of modern lies, let's rewind and see what happened to the main actors in this medieval